for the remaining participants. It's a pleasure to be with you here. Let me start by expressing my personal deep appreciation for Dr. Abla for really relentless efforts since and before the COP27 in order to focus on the COP27 and beyond. Of course, I pay a price for the kind of pressure that she has been putting on me, among others. But nevertheless, at least we are here gathering in order to discuss very important issues. I'm afraid that I missed a lot of the session in the morning, but let's hope that this session would allow for genuine discussions regarding the nexus between climate, poverty, and the way forward to realistic steps on the road to Africa's green transition. In fact, I argued with Dr. Abla that I wanted very much to take part in this session out of the importance of the issue and, of course, the importance of Africa to Egypt, particularly since we have convened COP27 on behalf of the African countries. We have here a group of distinguished speakers, but I think we'll skip the ladies first rule and we'll apply the age rule. So we'll start by Dr. Sidi, and I'll tell him when he comes, he'll come a little bit later. Sidi is in Upper Egypt, at least means my grandfather. So we'll start by Dr. Sidi Ould, Director General of the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, BADEA. Mr. Mamadou Biteye, Executive Secretary, the African Capacity Building Foundation, ACBF. Ms. Dina Sherif, Executive Director at the Legatum Center for Development and Entrepreneurship at MIT. I thought that we should, in order to trigger an effective discussions, that at least to mention some facts and figures that would reflect how important is the issue, particularly in view of a trend that, in fact, causes some concern among many people. I'm one of them, is that to focus on climate change as if it is an independent issue, while, which of course that financially would mean less funding, while the climate change is very much linked with other aspects, on top of them, poverty, as well as sustainable development, migration, refugees, because there is a new term that has emerged recently as the environment refugee, because of the climate deterioration, that has caused several consequences. And if you put all these elements, in a package, that means that we are talking about a gloomy picture for Africa in terms of extreme poverty, migration, refugees, meaning that you are talking about lack of security, disputes. There are parts of Africa where disputes are over the natural resources. I won't name countries, but this is a fact which is happening, that there are disputes because of the drought and, and the competition on natural resources, leading eventually to instability, which affects not only African countries, as well as it affects other countries, in the West. In order to just give our participants some points to remind, climate if I mention some challenges, climate change is costing the continent, the African continent, between 5% and 50% of its per capita GDP growth. Africa's adaptation financing needs are estimated at $52.7 billion annually through 2030. The entire continent is responsible just for 3% of the global carbon emissions. Over half or 50% of the world's poorest countries are in Africa. The failure of the continent to meet the Paris targets will mean that 118 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty by 2030. Just think of the figures, please, because we don't want to just to hear them, but I want you to listen to them. 15% of Africa hard-earned GDP growth will be wiped out. That the African countries is home to 33 of the world's 47 least developed countries, and sub-Saharan Africa remains the world's region with the largest access to energy deficit. And there are other figures, of course. The message I think we should initiate in this discussion that Africa is not here or there to beg. Because the African countries have resources, they have solutions, and they have recommendations. This is something very important that we have to address. Just to give some examples, Africa is home to 2 of the world's largest solar projects, particularly in Egypt and Morocco. And 2 of Africa's 20 fast-growing companies in 2022 are in the solar energy business. In 2020, and this is a message to Dr. Sidi, 63% of the African Development Bank funding went to projects related to climate change adaptations, and the largest share of any development finance institutions and committed under $12 billion towards climate adaptation financing through the AAAP. I don't want to take long of your time, but again, I hope that these points would help our distinguished speakers and would give us a chance to discuss not only among ourselves, but I would like very much to encourage the participants in order to engage into questions, discussions as much as we can. So I would suggest, I don't know how long we can continue, Dr. Abla, but I would suggest that every speaker will have 15 minutes, hopefully, although we never respect this kind of time frame, but nevertheless, I hope that at least we target 15 minutes for each participant, and then we allow, if possible, another 30 minutes for discussions. And by that, I would like to thank you very much for listening, and then we'll have our discussions. Miss Dina, you will not be the first to start. We said no ladies first, all right? But I'll go back to my seat, and we'll have our discussion. Before we start, I think, as we have agreed, I would like to inform the participants that Dr. Sidi Ould will be a little bit late. He will be penalized, for that, but we'll start till he comes, and with Mr. Mamadou Biteye, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, Executive Secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation, And I hope he would give us enough thoughts about how crucial is capacity building for the African countries. Meanwhile, that should not be understood as if that the African countries are short of capacities. But I think with the challenges of climate change, capacity building has become equal to other factors, even finance, technology, whatever, because if you can have finance and technology, but you don't have capable people, particularly youth and women, then the whole process will be short of implementation. So in advance, I would like to thank you. I'll give you 15 minutes. Beyond the 15 minutes, every minute you'll have to pay in digital coin, because that was discussed in the previous session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and good afternoon to all participants. Good afternoon also to my fellow panelists, Dina, Sherif. I will try my best. Since I don't have my e-wallet right now, it will be difficult to pay e-currencies. So I better stay on time. I think the conversation is really, I'm not going to spend time on what is at stake. I think we all know it. It has been largely discussed, and it was reminded to us by President Mary Robinson what needs to happen globally in terms of reducing carbon footprint and reducing heat waves for the planet to continue to survive. But at this point, everything that we are seeing happening in the world is by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is telling us every fact that we see is pointing to the possibility that by year 2100, life as we know it will have changed radically because of the global temperature. So, and this things have to change. So to me, then, I'm not going to spend more time with what is there. But what do we need? What do we want in Africa when we talk about the nexus between climate change and poverty? What we need is, number one, fair and just transition. The real risks of job losses, stranded assets, and the opportunity cost of foregoing fossil fuels, we have to balance it against the benefit of greening and financing the transition. Number two, we have in Africa 600 million people actually without access to energy. So universal access to energy is a big priority for Africa, especially when we talk about access to energy for productive use. Equally, extremely important, and affordability for our SMEs that make up more than 80% of our economies in Africa. This will require more intensified exploitation of both renewable and non-renewable sources of energy in Africa to close the energy inequality gap. Another area is food security for the continent, mechanizing agriculture and adopting yield, boosting farming methods, including the use of fertilizers and chemicals, and sustainable agriculture systems will be required. That's what we want, because we need to be able to feed ourselves, our people. We have seen recently with COVID and also with the war that we see in Europe, actually, that we have more than half of the available arable lands, yet actually Africa was on the brink of food insecurity because of the dependency on only 2 countries. So this needs to change. This is what we need. And we need strengthened resilience while protecting the environment. We need to adopt smart solutions to stimulate industrialization and transformation of our economies. Those are things that we need in Africa, and I think there is large consensus around that. So then the dilemma in these aspirations for our continent is to propel its growth and transformation. It may require to exploit fossil fuels, apply farming systems and industrialization techniques with relatively high carbon emissions. So a differentiated use of these resources and techniques is required to ensure that the continent can take advantage of its natural resources base to expedite its development while sustainably exploiting its natural resources for a cleaner environment. So a couple of things here and I think that we need to really focus on, and it's about really 7 measures that I'm going to work the audience through. First of all, we believe that we need engagement based on common but differentiated responsibility. That Africa's position in the global climate discussion should be based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility that delivers a win-win for the developing and developed worlds. Our engagement should be funded on a collaborative strategy that involves developed countries providing the enabling technology and financing for Africa to transition to a green and sustainable economy in the manner that preserves progress on the much needed growth in low-income countries. But to have that, we also need, you said it, Your Excellency, Africa has capacities, but we need capacities as well at scale in number that allows us to have the voice on the negotiation table. During the review of the Paris Climate Agreement, only 1% out of 5,000 experts, less than 100 were Africans. So it's very minimal. So, and we know in these kinds of conversations, if you are not on the table, if you are not at the table, then you are probably on the menu because you're not able to put in your own and push for your own interests. The other thing to me is dismantling bottlenecks to a green economy transition. And 2 things need to happen. To dismantle 2 main obstacles that accelerate Africa's green economy transition. First, I believe that governments must trim down and in many cases, discontinue widespread energy subsidies on fossil fuels. The average subsidization rate in Africa is about 33%, with the cost of fossil fuel subsidies representing an average of 3.8% of GDP. And we all know when energy subsidies are inefficiently applied, they fundamentally encourage excessive energy consumption through distorted lower prices that work to disincentivize investment in efficient and cleaner energy sources. The second area as a bottleneck is green energy investment in Africa, especially in renewable energy. You talked about the gap, and this gap is, we see that in the past 10 years, actually the growth we have seen has been concentrated in developed and transition economies. One of the things that we realize, speaking to different funds, for instance, speaking to the JEF or the GCF and other funding mechanisms, is that they are having a problem of pipeline, of bankable, fundable projects. So we realize that there is a huge need for capacity for African governments, central and decentralized, but also for African private sector for the capacity for project preparation in terms of being really bankable and fundable. I think that will go really a long way in terms of addressing some of the part of the gap. We also need to use the abundant natural gas as a bridging step to the energy transition. So greater use of natural gas would help to close the energy gap for people and businesses, as well as advancing the low carbon transition and creating jobs. Fourth is decentralization. While Africa is experiencing rapid urbanization, 50% of its population is still rural. So off-grid and mini-grid systems will be crucial in closing the energy gap for rural dwellers. Africa must also provide efficient services for its rapidly urbanizing population. Smart, sustainable cities will be engine of growth, enabling trade in goods and services to flow across various other chains. So I would insist again, most and a lot of investment goes to generation of energy, to transportation, but we know that this is not reaching really rural areas and really to provide access for the SMEs that are concentrated in rural areas, particularly in agriculture, power, value addition, and processing of goods. It will be important to look at really increased investment in off-grids and mini-grid systems that are more agile to provide. And then I will talk about digitalization as the fifth area, where we can harness the global shift in digital technologies. In 2020 or 2021, we have seen in 2020 progress worth a 3 years worth of digitalization acceleration happened in just 1 year. So this is strong, this is irreversible, and Africa also will need to really adopt these digital technologies to drive low carbon economies. So the rise of digital connectivity is already expanding opportunities for SMEs. There are more than 300 unique digital platforms, mostly homegrown, 80% of them, matching producers and consumers of goods and services in diverse economic sectors. And this is extremely important. In 2021, the World Economic Forum released a report, which is predicting that 70% of wealth created in the next decade is going to be through these digital platforms. And we believe that there is a huge opportunity there as well to really address the disparities between men and women, rural and urban, and close the capacity building gap to access credit and other facilities. And the last point I'm going to talk about, or one more, is using energy, cities, and land as drivers of green transformation. These key sectors are major growth enablers that are essential to Africa's development and will play a major role in the continent's green transition. Africa's population will double by 2050, and with an increasingly young population and rapid urbanization, feeding and providing livelihoods to the projected 2.5 billion people will be a challenge. Key issues will be ensuring food security, absorbing excess labor, and providing power to support homes and businesses. The continent must reimagine these sectors in ways that promote the circular economy and renewable energy to avoid the risk of being locked in to outdated and unsustainable production systems based on fossil fuels and the revenue losses due to stranded assets. So a lot of investment in innovation around that is going to be important. The seventh and last, and I think that will be 15 minutes, is really leveraging innovative financing approaches and mechanisms, as well as initiatives such as the debt for climate investment swaps, the Great Blue Wall, the Great Green Wall, the Congo Basin Blue Fund, among others, to mobilize the requisite financial resources for green transition. You mentioned African Development Bank, which has issued a number of green bonds that have been successfully subscribed to. I believe that if my souvenirs are correct, The last one was issued in Rand in South Africa. And I think that this is a huge and important opportunity to really raise private capital that can be invested into green the businesses across Africa. And I think that if my brother, Dr. Sidi, was here, I would encourage BADEA to do the same, but I do encourage many other financial institutions to look at those opportunities as well. I would stop there, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your statement and for stopping as well. That was, you know, you respected very much that time frame. But I think that your statement is very much significant in reflecting how challenging is capacity building, you know, under the climate change and its requirements. And capacity building is not simply training or even training trainers, but it is related to many challenges. To mention a few: food security, the role of youth and women, transition to green economy, green investment in Africa, population, circular economy, which is one of the concepts that are overlooked in so many occasions. I mean, because circular economy will have huge implications on the economic and trade relations, because it's not just a climate phenomena, but it is economic and social issue, which should be taken together with climate change as well. What I hope, Mr. Biteye, that in the discussions that we will have, that we cover, as well as to Miss Dina. By the way, my daughter's name is Dina, so you could expect a special treatment. That if we can cover the climate change with two major aspects. One is poverty, as we mentioned, as well as the sustainable economic and social development. And in here, I would like to refer to something which is happening, and I think it's not receiving enough attention, that due again to the crisis in Ukraine and resorting particularly the European countries to fossil oils, now huge investments from Europe are directed to Africa, which have huge as well potentialities and reserves of fossil oils. So the African countries are being put in a challenge that, you know, they are being pushed positively, and from their point of view, to use their fossil oil and natural gas reserves, because they need investments. They need to finance their economic and social development. But meanwhile, they cannot afford the requirements of climate change. And here, capacity building is coming as a challenge. Where the developed countries, you know, can play a role, because, you know, I think that the declared position of Africa, well, you are welcome to come and invest in our oil and natural gas, but you have to take care of the climate change with technology and finance. So I think it's important that we can cover this to see how we encourage African countries, you know, for a position where we can have a combination of international efforts in order to get out of the deep crises that the whole world is involved in. So I hope that we can cover this in the discussion as well with Miss Sherif, Dina Sherif, with whom I give her the floor.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and I love that your daughter's name is Dina. I really want to thank Dr. Abla, because she's a fearless leader, and I think only women like her can create change in the world, but only a person like Dr. Abla can bring up this amazing lineup of speakers that have been here. And Mamadou, you spoke to my heart with a lot of your last comments around the circular economy and financing. I'm not a climate person, as a disclaimer, and I represent a center that focuses on entrepreneurship and innovation, and so I don't have 15 minutes of words to fill, but I do have a very particular message around the importance of entrepreneurship and innovation in the climate transition, specifically in Africa. And I think it's really important for all of us, as we talk about climate, to really think about the narrative that we are putting forth specifically about Africa. My center at MIT over the past 5 years has had a very heavy focus on Africa, and that's for very particular reasons. I know that when we think of Africa, we think about poverty, we think about conflict, we think about the massive difficulties that exist on the continent in order for prosperity to be achieved. And I think while Africa's climate has warmed more than the global average since before pre-industrial times, I think sea level rise along African coastlines is faster than the global mean, and it's contributing massively to issues related to coastal flooding, erosion, farming, and these are areas of grave concern, and definitely have contributed to higher concerns, specifically with regards to the future of Africa's prosperity. But when you kind of compare that with the extent to which Africa as a continent has committed to global emissions, Africa's problem is not mitigation. And when we think of the developed world, they have a massive challenge because they have contributed the highest percentage to global emissions, whereas Africa has contributed less than 3% to global emissions. And I think that while Africa as a continent contributes very little to global emissions, it has been impacted the most by climate change. And it has made it even more vulnerable. Having said that, I think it's very important for us to recognize a different narrative, that Africa is the second largest continent in the world and is considered by many to be the birthplace of mankind. You know, as an Egyptian, I'm very proud to own that Africa is also home to the longest river in the world, which is the Nile River, a river that we hold very dear to us as Egyptians. It's also home to some of the oldest civilizations. And when you think about it, 25% of the world's languages are only spoken in Africa. It has the largest youth population in the world, and it's expected to be, and Mamadou mentioned this, it's expected to be home to 1.7 billion people by 2030. According to a recent report by the World Economic Forum, 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world, 6 of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world are actually in Africa. So for me, while Africa faces many challenges, it's also the youngest and the fastest growing continent in the world. And as we think about the energy transition, and with this incredible shift that we have to make to renewable energy, this is, for me and for many of us at MIT, we see this as a vast opportunity for Africa. And I think the potential for entrepreneurship and innovation to create change on the continent and to drive further development of new industries on the continent, which will then create jobs and will then create prosperity and new markets for the continent, are vast. I think when we talk about the climate transition and nature loss, we don't focus enough on the importance of investing in entrepreneurship education, of investing in R&D, of investing in commercialization of R&D. And we certainly don't talk about that on the African continent enough. Although I would argue that what we're seeing today is an incredible increase in entrepreneurship on the continent that is innovation driven. We're seeing an amazing and inspiring increase of women entrepreneurs on the continent. And we're seeing a lot of entrepreneurs who are moving into the climate space out of necessity. And I think what we're not seeing is an equal increase in investment in venture capital flowing towards these innovators. And so I don't want to speak for 15 minutes. What I want to say is that entrepreneurs, specifically, as we call them at MIT, innovation-driven entrepreneurs, have a massive role to play in turning what we all perceive as a challenge into a massive opportunity. I think venture capital and risk capital has an even bigger role to play. I think, as Mary Robinson said this morning, we need to stop financing what we don't need. And we need to start financing what will allow us to transition that will allow us to allow for the climate transition. And I think we aren't seeing enough risk capital flow towards climate entrepreneurs, and that's problematic. And I think that different institutions who are thinking about how to support the climate transition in Africa really need to think carefully about how to increase the amount of risk capital that flows to African innovators. The bottom line is that Africa is critical to the climate transition, and I would argue that the climate transition won't happen without Africa and African innovators. Our biggest challenge today as a continent is really adaptation, which puts us already at a massive advantage. What we need to do as African and as an African continent is to really change the narrative and remember that the continent has a lot of resources. We have a lot of abundance, and we have amazing African entrepreneurs who are rising and who need to be raising the kind of risk capital that is required to scale these businesses on the continent. And I think that if we play our cards right and really start doubling down or tripling down on the amount of investment we put in R&D, specifically R&D that's focused on innovation in climate and nature loss on the continent, we are going to become a continent that is exporting technology to solve the climate challenge. And that's a wonderful place for us to be in if we think very creatively. And I know that we as a center at MIT, at the Legatum Center, we focus a lot on climate entrepreneurs, and we focus a lot on talking to venture capitalists about the need to invest in climate. And I hope that, as we start moving very quickly to COP28, having put COP27 behind us, I think one of the disappointments that I took away from COP27 is that we didn't put front and center these innovators who are coming up with technologies specifically in climate change and nature loss, and how we can think about financing. Because we talk about financing, we're thinking about very large financing vehicles for infrastructure. And what we're talking about is how do we increase the share of venture capital that goes to your very early stage entrepreneur to get them on that journey to scale a business that can solve multiple problems on the continent, including poverty. When you invest in an entrepreneur, that entrepreneur can create multiple layers of value by solving a massive challenge through a scalable business model, but by creating jobs that will have an impact on poverty and wealth generation on the continent. And so I think that's the message that I'll leave everyone with. I unfortunately have a hard stop in 10 minutes, but I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dina. I would not exaggerate in making compliments to you because my wife is here and I don't want to be penalized when I'm back home. But really, I would like to thank you very much for your statement. I hope it's on behalf of MIT and not exclusively a personal point of view.
This is on behalf of MIT.
But I think, among the very important points that you have just raised is that, Africans' challenges is not primarily adaptation, mitigation, but rather development. I mean, this is the challenge Africa is facing, and that Africa is very critical to climate change. And you highlighted an element which is extremely important, which is entrepreneurs. I think this is something is not being discussed more often and needs to be addressed more deeply, because I strongly believe that Africa is not a continent that is short of entrepreneurs, or it's there to big. It's and that what is being, supported, the support Africa is receiving. I decline the term kind of charity or whatever. I think it's not an assistance. It is an obligation by the world. It is a responsibility by the world, right? Because the Africans are paying a price for actions that they have not been part of it. So either in the past, no, or in the present. I think it's important that we deal with Africa with a different approach, with an innovative and realistic approach, because what we have been seeing, and allow me to take part of this discussion, just see how many players are very active in Africa, looking for resources and for investments, so on and so forth. So I think Africa is not just a needy continent, but it is a growing continent with huge resources. But in order to invest these resources, I mean, there is an obligation by the international community in order to serve, the investments in Africa in favor of climate change, in favor of social and economic sustainable development, and in favor of something very important for the rich countries, which is stability and peace. I think it is something very important that we need to discuss. Now, since my grandfather is a little bit late, Mr. Sidi, we'll go back to Mr. Biteye just to continue our discussions, take into consideration, the points that I have suggested at the beginning, and the very important points made by Ms. Dina, to continue our discussions, and hoping for the arrival of Dr. Sidi. And then we will move immediately to the floor and all for the participants in order to engage into a fruitful discussion. Thank you, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador, but I beg your pardon. I wasn't clear what you would like me to speak to.
Mamadou, I have a question for you. You spoke very eloquently about the importance of financing and the circular economy. The drivers of the circular economy are really going to be Africa's youth and their young innovators. Only 1% of global venture capital is allocated to African entrepreneurship or African innovators, let's say. But in your opinion, how can we see that increase? Because Africa is home to I think we have, as a continent, one of the most rapidly increasing generations of innovation-driven entrepreneurial talent. But we're not seeing an equivalent investment. And I think that's related to the narrative shift of seeing African entrepreneurs as a massive opportunity. So how can we see that increase in financing flow more towards the innovators on the ground, specifically in the economy?
No, that's a great question. And I think that it is not just to me about how to increase the flows, but once these businesses are successful, how to retain them, because the other thing is also when these few unicorns and strong businesses actually are often, sold, put on the market and actually renewed from the continent as well. So first of all, it's actually, I think, first of all, it's innovation in the financing market. Because oftentimes we look at most things that is being used is debt, credit. And I think that there are so many more, ways to finance, to provide financial support that are not just that. We can think about, different other methods such as what do you call it again? You know, I often give this example, you know, that when I need to move from one house to another, obviously I don't have a truck. Do I need to buy a truck to do that? Or do I need to be able to use a truck for that day, for that particular need, to be able to do that? So this is one of the biggest challenges, you know, that many of these entrepreneurs face, you know. So the diversity of services, and especially financial services that they can use, and which puts a very high requirement of capital in actually investment in capital equipment, most of which actually they don't need to own, and they can actually just actually use for what they need. That's one thing. So really looking at the full spectrum of different financing mechanisms, you know, not just relying on debt. That's one thing. The second thing, I think that there is also if I look at, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, in many countries, there are not many national banks, right? And national banks actually feeling the belonging and the high responsibility in taking high risk to financing also entrepreneurship is something that we are not seeing. Many of the banks are over liquid, but they actually just limit their activity to primary services, collection of savings and distribution and all of that, but not necessarily taking the risk to go into entrepreneurship. That I think that really political will and investment in really creating more national banks, I think, can play a role in doing that. But it's also using other innovative methods, particularly crowdfunding also can be, we don't use it a lot, and this is something that can be used in Africa. So, however, at the end of the day, for me, it's also about preparation and readiness of the SMEs themselves, right? Particularly I think that there is a need for increased capacity building in institutions that support those innovators and those startup, you know, businesses coming from innovation, particularly in the climate area, circular economy, and what have you. Oftentimes, support institutions are not always very strong in terms of really providing what I would call relevant, really tailored, you know, support in capacity building, you know, for these institutions as well. So I think that there is really a lot of things that can be done in this area, but I think it's really going out of the well-traveled roads and looking at all the innovative mechanisms that are available here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me interrupt a little bit this initiative by Ms. Dina to engage directly in a kind of discussion with one of the speaker. But let me welcome Dr. Sidi Ould, Director General of the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa. And for your sake, Dr. Sidi, we suggested to skip the ladies first rule to start with you, with just using your name, because Sidi, it means for us grandfather. So we thought that we should start with you, but apparently you learned that that's why you absentee yourself. So you are most welcome. Let me just give you a brief on the points that were made before your arrival. We had two very important interventions by Mr. Mamadou Biteye, the Executive Secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation, and Ms. Dina Sherif, Executive Director of the Legatum Center for Development and Entrepreneurship, MIT, at MIT. And among the points, the important points that were raised by Mr. Abiti is that, that among the challenges that Africa is facing is food security, the role of youth and women, investing into the green economy, the circular economy, the digitization and even more digitalization. I raised the point that we want very much to discuss an aspect that we should resist, namely that climate change is not an independent issue by itself, but it's very much linked with poverty and with the sustainable development, with the migration, with the refugees, above all, that would, is very much linked to peace, security, and stability in Africa, which has an impact on the outside world. And then Ms. Dina has raised the problems that Africa is not only digitization or mitigation, but it is the development. And she spoke about entrepreneurs as one of the important issues that need attention in Africa, because they have a major role to not only climate change but for development as well. And my comment was simply that we should deal with Africa not as a beggars or needy continent, rather than it is a rich country, or if it's poor on the surface, but it is the richest, underground. And we can see that, in the quality and the magnitude of players, in Africa for investments, so on and so forth. Let me just, in order to provoke you a little bit, that, that at my introduction, I raised an important aspect of the bank, namely that 63% of your funding, went for, let me see where I am. Anyway, for climate change in African countries, and this is, correct me if I'm mistaken. So it is, we would expect, coming from a distinguished banker, which has this kind of Africa-Arab linkages. I think it's very important to, you don't need to impress us. We are already impressed. But we need just to learn more about the role of the bank, not only in the present, but how are you looking ahead? Let's say post COP27 or COP27 beyond. We are approaching very near. We are very near to COP28, and the COP27, Egypt convened on behalf of African countries. Now, it will be held in Emirates, and expectations, are a little bit confused, and where to go from there, because in COP27, I think under the circumstances, with the complicated economic situation and the gloomy world economy, I mean, that was, the results that have been achieved were much better than expected. Otherwise, could have faced a much worse situation, but yet the problems remain there, but rather than the challenges are increasing. So where can the bank could contribute, to advise, to recommend, to show how the contribution of the bank could really be a kind of model that to be followed by other banks as well as by other countries. The floor is yours, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And I would like to thank also Dr. Abdul Latif for giving me this opportunity to be with you and to learn from the wisdom and the knowledge you are disseminating. I would like also to take this opportunity to congratulate the Arab Republic of Egypt for a successful COP27, which was, as you rightly mentioned, was a success by all means, particularly when we take into account the difficult time of the year 2022, which was a special year with many crises around the world. COP27 was also a new departure for the international community. And for the first time, the international community agreed on the loss and damages issue, which is a breakthrough compared to the previous COP that we have attended. Coming back to the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, BADEA, the bank has been established as a special institution fully dedicated to African countries who are not members of the Arab League. Of course, the bank has been working in close partnership with the Arab Coordination Group, which include other 9 institutions. Most of them are operating in the continent and providing very useful support, not only to climate change related activities, but also to the sustainable development in general in sub-Saharan Africa. So the bank focus over the next coming year will be the translation of the objective set by the BADEA 2030 strategy, which is the bank strategy. And that strategy is centered around 4 main pillars. The first pillar is related to infrastructure. And as you know, the infrastructure gap in Africa is estimated between 90 billion and 100 billion US dollar a year. So the bank has been very active in the infrastructure field over the past 4 decades and has been also partnering with other Arab institutions to contribute to bridging the gap in terms of infrastructure. But what is new for the bank and also for other institutions is the new dimension of the infrastructure financing paradigm, because we are no longer focusing on the state, the government-owned enterprises and projects, but we are rather open to public-private partnership and green infrastructure. And we do believe that the continent has huge potential to develop green infrastructure, and the potential of renewable energies, for instance, but also the food security sector are quite important, not only from a strategic point of view for the continent, but also for the fight against poverty, the fight to eradicate poverty in Africa. The second pillar of the bank strategy, BADEA 2030, is about agricultural value chain. And as you know, most African countries are exporting raw materials and importing finished products. So it is important to develop activities which entail the transformation, the processing of agricultural products in Africa to create jobs for youth and women, but also to add value and, of course, to contribute to the increase of the gross domestic product. So the bank, if we take the example of the cocoa product, 3 countries in Africa produce more than 75% of the world production of cocoa. Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Nigeria. If we look at the market, the chocolate market, and co-correlated beverages in the world, it is more than $1 billion US. And the share of those three countries is barely 6 billion, which represent roughly 6%. So we see that the value is captured by those who don't produce cocoa. So this is why the bank decided to focus over the next coming year on supporting agro-industrial parks and all the value chains to support the value addition on the continent. The third pillar, which is quite related to the two previous pillars, is the support to micro, small, and medium enterprises. As you know, micro, small, and medium enterprises represent more than 90% of the economic tissue in Africa. And if we are aiming at supporting job creation for youth and women empowerment, the best way to do it is to support micro, small, and medium enterprises. Of course, it's not only about providing financing, which is key, because only 20% of MSMEs have access to financing. But more importantly, we need to develop their capacity to manage their business and their ability to develop a business plan, to develop their accounting system, their legal documentation, and their ability to compete in a global market and to reap the benefit of the digital transformation. And this is why our partnership with the African Capacity Building Foundation, and I welcome the presence of my brother, Mamadou Biteye, who is the executive secretary of ACBF. So our partnership with them is very important as part of what we call the global coalition to support micro, small, and medium enterprises in Africa. And ACBF is a key partner in this coalition, which is meant to gather all the stakeholders who are supporting, in a way or another, the micro, small, and medium enterprise in Africa. So the fourth pillar of BADEA's 2030 strategy is about private sector and trade. And as you know, the private sector is supposed to be the engine for the growth in Africa. But unfortunately, the private sector is impeded by many obstacles, which hamper the ability of the sector to play the role which is expected from it to play. Trade also is quite very important to provide the right support to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to be implemented in the right way. So, and to develop cross-border transaction among African countries, and to develop the ability of the continent to have a weight in the international trade. As you know, the weight of the continent today is not commensurate with the weight of the African potential, the African population. This is in a nutshell what we are intending to implement over the next coming years. And we really look forward to work with all of you, think tanks, civil society organization, all stakeholders and partners who want to join hands to work together for a better world and better Africa.
Thank you very much, Dr. I wish you started with us this session, then we could have enjoyed more. I mean, the very important statement that you have just made. And, you know, I think I would summarize all the aspects that you have raised in one word: development. I think all these aspects are we are talking about social, economic, environmental development. And you have raised important points, that, not only as we started, climate change is not a pollution issue or just as an independent issue, but it's very much related to economic development, social development, to migration, refugees, for stability in Africa and outside world. And I think it's this is we just to provide us with a kind of positive appetite for expecting, a more constructive role by the bank with that kind of comprehensive approach. I think this is very much needed. And we started at the very beginning that there is a concern that you isolate the climate change from all the kind of aspects that you have just raised. You spoke, for example, about biodiversity. And there we sometimes, we feel that there is a kind of determined approach in order to exclude, other, particularly poverty. So I think it's very important that we listen to you. But I want to be fair to you, to tell you the statement I made in your absence. And of course, there is no free lunch. All right, when we get together, we'll have to discuss this. In 2020, 63% of the African Development Bank, AFDB, funding went to projects related to climate change. Am I mistaken in the bank? No? Is that information relates to your bank or the African Development Bank?
African Development. We are the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, BADEA.
Okay.
But our contribution is also very, very substantial to the development, to the.
Well, I think that the aspect is covered, by we know, I mean, from the recorded information that that you allocate significant funds for climate change projects, and this is a role which is very important. And if that together with the African Development Bank, then that would give us more hope, and that Africa is working by itself in order to justify their case. And again, it's as I said in the beginning, Africa is not there to beg. Africa and assistance is not, to me, is not the right term. I think this is an obligation by the international community. It is a responsibility by the international community. It's not a charity. So if Mr. Biteye has a quick comment, because I got instructions from the lady that of course, there is no way. I mean, she is a little bit soft. Anyway, that we'll have to bring the session to an end because we are already late, behind the schedule. If there is a final comment by Mr. Biteye, it would be most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, Your Excellency, and I'm very pleased actually by those comments made by Dr. Sidi Ould on really where the banks goes. I think that we all agreed that actually climate change, adaptation, green transition is about really, I wouldn't say poverty, I would like to say the other way, wealth creation, because wealth creation is about really what allows you to have additional disposable income, really to go beyond subsistence and to invest, into other means that allow you to go further. So we really appreciate the opportunity. I didn't start by this, but I want to end by this, by really thanking Dr. Abdel Latif for her leadership, for giving us this opportunity. Actually, for the small story, Dr. Abdel Latif and myself, we were introduced by actually Dr. Sidi Ould in Dubai 2 years ago. And he said, actually, you are two great people and I want you to work together. Sidi, thank you for introducing us. Since then, we have done a lot together, maybe some that you are not aware of, but we haven't stopped working together since then. So thank you for bringing leadership together. Thank you very much.
Dear brother, we are not here to talk about Dr. Abla, please. We are just here to discuss important issues, and
This is
I
important.
wish you can talk about me if you want, but I mean, it's not fair to talk about her because you don't see the kind of suffering that we are having with the pressure she put on us. All right. But anyway, let me really thank you. By the way, Miss Dina not only left, but left a photo with a new look. You know, inform us of her absence. She had to leave, but I would like very much to thank you. I personally enjoyed very much, you know, the kind of discussion. I wish we had more time to get into more elaborate exchange of views, but we promise you that we inshallah, will have more sessions and more occasions where we can discuss, you know, the wealth creation of Africa, as you very much correctly said, and the future of Africa. Africa's future is very promising, and you know, we look forward that Africa will prove that it can help the world rather than being assisted. Thank you very much, and please stay with me to have a photo. Everybody has left. I don't know. No, you know, Dr. Abla wants to have a photo with me. I mean, and my wife is here. I mean, anyway, thank you very much for, I apologize to the floor, to the participants of not having enough time for the discussions, although you have time to eat, but I wish we had more time to discuss and exchange views, but I wish you all the best, and Mr. Biteye, we hope to see you soon. And if not before, definitely, inshallah, we'll see you in Emirates for COP28. Thank you very much.